it worked out really, really great. Obviously, company's grown into what they were, and up until the early 2000s, they were far and away the biggest brand name on the block. And at the time, broker was kind of a dirty word. And so at the time, you really had Robinson, you had American Backhaulers.
Why was broker a dirty word?
Because it just wasn't viewed as positively as it was today, that you had these images of people scamming each other.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Freight Caviar podcast. Before we do begin, I wanted to give a special shout out to Dynamic Logistix, today's sponsor of the Freight Caviar podcast episode. Dynamic Logistix gives you total control of your entire shipping operations, live location and status updates every 15 minutes, and the ability to combine multiple orders into a single load, leading to significant savings. Check them out at dynamiclogistix.com. That's logistics with an X.
So we're here right now in Phoenix, Arizona at the TIA conference, Capital Ideas Conference 2024. Coincidentally, I was flying to Phoenix here 2 days ago, and I've been doing like these kind of like airplane interviews where we do like ask someone anything on the airplane in freight online. And I posted a photo on Twitter like saying, I didn't find anyone, so I'm just going to interview myself. And so I'm just sitting in my seat. And then 40 minutes after we depart, Phil here just nudges me, and he pulls up my tweet, and he was like, I follow you on Twitter. And I'm like, wow, get out of here.
And this was a flight from Poland.
Chicago.
Okay.
You said the flight had already been departed. You were in the air?
We were in the air. Half hour, 40 minutes.
We've been seeing each other for at least 40 minutes already at this point.
Sitting next to each other.
Already? Sitting next to each other for 40 minutes?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. And then he just pulls up the tweet. How fortuitous.
Yeah, that is. It was entertaining.
Were you scrolling at the time?
Yeah. I was on the Wi-Fi, and I was checking some email, and then I went to Twitter, and I looked at it, and I said, huh.
You're literally sitting.
Yeah, you're sitting next.
Hey, what up?
I looked at his picture, and I could see I had my portable phone charger tucked in my seat pocket in front of me. I'm like, I look over at him, and I tap on the shoulder.
That's okay. That's great. So,
wow.
Yeah, big coincidence there. And then Phil and I started talking. So I know, Phil, your story, but I definitely want to get in more depth into your journey in the logistics industry. I know that in 1997, you started at C.H. Robinson. They had just gone public at that time.
Yep.
And then you ended up running the Intermodal division for over the last decade or so. And so you were there when C.H. Robinson acquired American Backhaulers. You know Jeff Silver quite well.
Yep.
We are sitting amongst the legend, man.
I don't know about all that, but yeah, I've done this for a really long time. My first grown-up job was at Hub Group, so I worked there for a few years. Great organization, got to know the Yeager family really well. And then a few years later, I was getting more serious about life, and I needed a job that had a little more, what I thought, upward mobility. I was getting serious with my now wife, and so it was one of those things where Robinson Recruiter had reached out to me and said, we're looking to really build out our intermodal platform, and we'd love somebody with some experience. And at the time, Hub Group was among the biggest in the industry, or biggest, I think, at the time.
As far as intermodal
goes. And so they brought me in, and I worked in one of the local branches at the time, because in the late 90s, Robinson was almost franchisee. I mean, they were all company-owned stores, but each office operated totally independently. There was little to no sharing with other branches. At the time, we had 3 branches in Chicago. We didn't they may as well have been competitors.
Wow.
That's how, at the time, we viewed it. So it was a very different dynamic. There was no visibility tools, right? So, here we are, and 27 years later, but the way the industry has changed is beyond remarkable. I mean, this was, again, I'm old, so this was old school writing out orders on, thank you, on cards and walking over, and basically I was the 40th person in what the time was called the Chicago South branch. And 3 years later, when I was asked to go lead the intermodal office, so I'll kind of jump ahead. So yeah, we had about 40 people when I started in the branch. When I left, there were probably 80 in there. So we just kept hiring and doubling down. That was Robinson's MO at the time, was hire people generate revenue, and the more people you have, the more revenue you'll have. So it was a pretty basic philosophy from that standpoint. And then in 2000,
there's already so much there that I would love to dive more into. Are you guys?
Let's digest a little bit. Let
me give you a quick little.
Okay, the overview, and then we can come back.
So in 2000, Robinson decided to get a little bit more serious about intermodal, and one of the ideas we had was this very decentralized environment is not the way to do it. We weren't ready to go completely central, so.
You mean the branch, like
branch,
yeah.
And so we created regional operating centers. So the branches would be the sales arm, and we would support them with sales, with subject matter experts and sales. But then we'd have the execution run in 6 different locations. So we did that for a while. That was a great interim step. You fast forward to 2005, and we made the decision to completely centralize in the Chicagoland area. At that time, I took on a different role, running some other enterprise initiatives, handling our major contracts with railroads, things like that. Did that for a while. Then after the Robinson acquisition of Phoenix in 2012, I was asked to come in and run all of the intermodal P&L. So I did that, worked with a bunch of peers on what's now called the NAST leadership team. So it was representatives from truckload, LTL, intermodal were responsible for all of what is currently NAST. So I did that up until 2021.
Whoa.
Spent the last 3 years on the equipment leasing side, and I'll have a new endeavor that I'm jumping into here at the end of the month that we'll be announcing in a couple of weeks.
Damn, that's wild. Okay, that was.
So there's probably a lot to unpack there.
That's a lot to unpack. For me personally, I would love to hear like the early days when you were at Hub Group and you were hearing about this company, C.H. Robinson. Were they already the titan, the giant that they are today?
Yeah, and so
they've been around. They're like the OG. Yeah, I mean they've been around forever.
Yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, 18. Robinson started in 1905 as a produce broker, and then after the Staggers Act and the deregulation of transportation, it really opened up doors because the management team at Robinson, going back to Sid Verdorn and company, who was the CEO when I first started, came up with the idea that, well, we're selling all this produce, why don't we move it too?
Yeah.
Nice. So monopoly a little bit, horizontal monopoly, I think.
Yeah, just being able to offer more vertically integrated services, right? So it worked out really, really great. Obviously, companies grown into what they were, and up until the early 2000s, they were far and away the biggest brand name on the block. And at the time, broker was kind of a dirty word. And so at the time, you really had Robinson, you had American Backhaulers.
Why was broker a dirty word?
Because it just wasn't viewed as positively as it was today, that you had these images of people scamming each other and screwing each other out of payments.
Was that somewhat like...
There was some truth to it, because if you think about today, the things that we worry about, double brokering and identity fraud and all of these things, there were no tools back then. Everything, the barrier to entry is nothing. It was, you had people setting up shop in their garage. All you needed was a card table and a phone. Computers, internet was brand new. So everybody didn't have internet at their desk in the early mid 90s. So that was still this ongoing phenomenon.
I saw it with a guy who owned a trucking company in that time, a Russian guy, one eye, and like just a badass, a total badass. And like you could tell this guy's like just like a dangerous looking guy. And he was telling me about how back when he owned the trucking company, he would come to brokers and they would pay cash right out the door. That was pretty normal, standard.
Yeah, and that was before my time.
Like customers would just pay you, go deliver it. They'd pay you cash, and like people just took their word. Is that at least what he was?
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to doubt that. That was before my time. But when I first started at Robinson, you were a jack of all trades. You were sourcing carriers, you were sourcing customers, you were managing accounts, you made sure the customers got paid. I can't tell you the number of times I went into the worst part of Chicago because I had a big customer down there who gave us a lot of business, didn't really love to pay us. They eventually would, but I'd have to show up down there, and every year at Christmas, I'd
Show some muscle.
Yeah.
Bring the lead pipe.
I'd have to go down there with like a Christmas gift for them. Bring them a fruit tray or some basketball tickets.
Okay, so that's
like
a better way than muscle.
Yeah, yeah. It's and walk in there and be like, hey, we've talking about this. You owe me $50,000, and walk out of there with a check payable to Robinson for $50,000. And but it was, I mean, that's how it was back then.
And you were wearing a lot of hats.
Oh yeah.
Hey there, amazing listeners. If you're enjoying what you're hearing on our podcast, we need your support. It will only take a moment, but it would mean the world to us. Please make sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to share with one of your friends that would enjoy our content. Your engagement helps us reach more people and bring more awesome episodes to you. Thanks a million, and thanks for being part of the podcast community.
I just want to structure this a little bit in a way because we have probably like 45 minutes or so. So I don't want to.
Yeah, I can talk.
Because we could get into like one topic and then sit there for 45 minutes. But I think there's a few points that I do want to touch on here. First is like the American Backhaulers acquisition when C.H. Robinson acquired them. Kind of talking about like the whole, I don't know, like acquisition and like kind of like what took place organizationally speaking.
Yeah.
And then maybe like dive into like the CH Intermodal division where like I know Reed actually asked the question about why does CH have
No, they have containers. I just see their containers. Yeah.
why do they get into the containers, stuff like that. And then kind of like I'm kind of curious of like the evolution of that program. So like Tom, if you're okay with that.
I am totally okay.
Yeah. If we had 3 hours, we could dissect everything.
Yeah.
But right now, I
Yeah.
just like I do want to get focused. So in 1999 or 2000 was it when CH acquired?
Yeah. The official closing date I think was early 2000. So it was announced in '99. Yeah.
Okay, and that was what, like I'm pretty sure it was like $400 million.
Yeah, somewhere in that range.
Probably a lot of stock.
Yeah, it was a combination. Again, it's all public record, so I don't recall it. It was a combination of cash and equity that was given to the senior management of backhaulers.
Sure.
So Paul Loeb was the CEO. Jeff Silver, John Thompson was the CFO. Those three were really the idea and money guys behind it. Then they brought in a bunch of really good people behind them, guys like Eddie Leshin that have been around for a long time, that have continued to do a great job and build it out and create the legacy. But it was an interesting time because what we figured out was the cultures probably couldn't be more different. Backhaulers...
Cultures can be more different.
Right. Backhaulers was much more entrepreneurial and very bifurcated in your job. You were a carrier salesperson or you were a customer salesperson. There was no expectation that you did both.
Yeah.
And they were also paid on commission, where Robinson at the time had these really low base salaries, but then you got a percentage of the cut of the bonus pool that was allocated to your office based on your office profitability. And it was very discretionary based on your general manager. And so when we were going through this integration process, and I was on the team, so I was based right there in Chicago, the first thing that the Robinson senior executive said is, do not talk about compensation. That's the third rail. Talk about common customers, talk about the technology we're using versus them. Anything you guys want to talk about, don't talk about compensation. So we get a group of us together, probably 12 or 15 of us. What's the first thing we talk about?
Compensation.
That's how it works.
And so
That's how human nature works.
that's right. So we had a guy who worked with me at Robinson. He was one of our top salespeople. We said, all right, he's got a book of business of X millions of dollars. Here's what the profitability looks like.
Yeah.
If someone had that at Backhaulers, how much money would they make? And they told us, and my buddy comes back, goes, what the hell? Getting screwed. Now, obviously, Robinson at the time had stock options that were available, that, again, manager discretion, but that would get doled out. If you had a good year, you may get a little more. So the top 10% or so in each office enjoyed some stock options. So that turned out to be pretty lucrative downstream for people. But at the time, we're going, man, at Robinson, we're getting paid 40 to 50% of what some of these backhaulers guys are making. Wow. This is bullshit.
Yeah.
I can say that, right?
Yeah, of course.
The more of it, the better, man.
You can now.
And so it was, it didn't change anything overnight, but it opened our eyes and said, and it actually opened some of the senior management at Robinson's eyes to say, this is something we're going to have to address sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we're going to have everybody wants to be over here. Yeah, exactly.
But they were traditionally a truckload brokerage,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
You guys, but you were part of Intermodal, so you
Yeah, but Intermodal was still pretty small at Robinson at that time, and Backhaulers had an Intermodal group that it was smaller than ours. They had a small team that was doing some. They were dabbling in LTL. Robinson was still learning LTL at the time. Neither company was as diverse as they are today. So it was an interesting time to go through that integration, and there's some great guys that I met during that. One of them I just hired in my previous company to come and join. So made some great relationships over there. We learned a lot from each other. So it was a good experience.
Okay. I'm kind of curious, like, why did C.H. Robinson want to acquire American Backhaulers?
So when we were out calling on customers, the number one broker that we heard as a competitor was Backhaulers.
Yeah.
And we would get frustrated as salespeople because for whatever reason, it felt like Backhaulers could offer customers cheaper rates. They were buying cheaper. So their customers were getting better pricing. Some of that is obviously anecdotal, but as a salesperson, that's all you heard is, well, they pay $300, we pay $350. Why the hell can't we buy for $300? And so there was some legitimacy to it when we started really getting down and looking at data. And it ultimately, in my opinion, came down to the incentive model. That if you're getting a fraction of a percent of this massive pie that comes much later, it's not as tangible as a commission that I'm going to get paid next week. So of that $50 delta there, that might be $5 for me, or $8 or $4 for me. And so if I extrapolate that out 15, 20 times a day, and I get to realize that immediate benefit next week, we just felt like they worked a little harder. That was from the desk level lens. From a senior management lens, they were the most legitimate competitor out there. They were really good at what they did. They had cutting edge technology. Jeff Silver was the brainchild, if I remember correctly, behind what at the time
What was their system
was called
Zuka Coyote.
Zuka?
Yeah. I'm blanking on it. Robinson rebranded it as Navisphere.
And they still use that.
And they still use it today. And so that was really the big turning point.
So they bought the tech and the company. So like the tech.
They bought the tech too, which is big, right?
And so Backhaulers had a central office building where everybody was in one office. You knew everybody. There was a really cool old brick warehouse on the north side of Chicago. And so everybody went down there, and so it was a cool one, but culturally it was a huge change. And to Robinson's credit, over time, it took a little bit of doing, but they actually started to migrate that way and said their technology is superior to ours. We had to do that. And then we had to get to that more segmented approach of realizing, because we said everyone did everything. Well, the truth was people naturally progressed and migrated toward what they liked. If you were better at covering loads, you did more of that. As long as you did enough of it, you still proved your value. But there was an expectation that you'd manage customers or you'd go and generate new business. But the point I kept making to the guy who had hired me was, the concept sounds great on paper, but account management is a different skill set than cold calling. And that's a difference in cold calling a trucking company is a different skill set than cold calling a Fortune 500 customer. And so at the time, there were no swim lanes. So we could have a 2-month employee calling on Procter & Gamble. And now in hindsight, you go, man, that's stupid. Because you could really do some brand damage if somebody who doesn't know their ass from their elbow starts spouting off stupid stuff to a high-end shipper like that. And that happened. Every once in a while, somebody did a home run, either on the customer or carrier side, and then you'd hear about how much money they made. But then over time, again, as the business matured, we were able to become a little bit more prescriptive in all the roles and how we went about it. So then you had people only selling, and then you migrated into swim lanes. So you had to be a more experienced salesperson to be calling on Procter & Gamble. So you aligned your target audience with your expertise.
And interesting. And throughout all of that, you were talking with CH management. Like how were you navigating, and you personally throughout all that? And like, would you learn, I suppose?
Yeah, we would certainly share some best practices. They brought a couple of different people in.
So you were in on a lot of those meetings with Jeff and the
when we were migrating over. And eventually it may come to me what the original system was, but when we were building it out for a bigger and then building other modules. So one of the reasons I got involved is they were building out an intermodal module for it so that we could operate within the system in a more constructive way. And so I sat in a bunch of meetings with Jeff. Jeff also lived in the Chicagoland area. At the time, there weren't that many airlines flying. It was Northwest Airlines flying to Chicago to Minneapolis. So Jeff and I had on the same plane together quite a bit. And
do you guys ever do podcasts on the plane? Or interview Twitter
yeah, we hadn't really thought about this at that point. Yeah,
We're part of the evolution of the industry.
yeah, but
Can we talk a little bit about intermodal real
please.
quick? Because
Of course.
because
You want to okay, I just have one quick question, then we could just segue into intermodal and talk about that.
go ahead.
That's it.
Go. Yeah.
I'm just curious, because how long was Jeff part of the whole acquisition process? When did he leave? And then because he started Coyote in 2007, I'm just curious, how long was he part?
yeah,
suited?
I may have the dates wrong. You may want to go to Jeff's LinkedIn background, but it was only a couple of years. May have been 2. Jeff was and still is to some degree a little bit of a rebel. He's happy to tell you what he thinks, whether you want to hear it or not. And that didn't mesh really well with some of the current personalities in the Robinson boardroom.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of headbutting on some of that. And Robinson traditionally had the mentality of the tail doesn't wag the dog. We acquired you. It doesn't, you don't tell us what to do.
So there was a little bit of tension.
There was a little bit of that. And, I don't mean this in a negative way. But where you say, Jeff legitimately is the smartest guy in the room. And some people think they are. Jeff actually is. And that's probably true in any room he's in.
And then being able to convince those other people, listen. Yeah.
And so you had people that have said, yeah, you guys built this great company, but you were only around for 20 years or whatever they were. We've been around for almost 100 years at this point. We know what we're doing. Don't tell us what to do. And so Jeff said, I'm out of here. He took a sabbatical. He had a non-compete for a period of time. He went to MIT, got some additional training.
That's where you met
Bill Drieger.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then one day, Coyote was born, and miraculously, they had an operating system that looked an awful lot like what Robinson was using.
Well, I mean, there was that was probably for the. I mean, that's what created so much. So many other companies. I mean, there's a whole family tree that sprouted out of that, right? Paul Loeb went into command after that, and that turned into a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. John Thompson started a company. I'm blanking on the name of it, but he started a 3PL in Chicago. Right? Paul had command, and so really what happened is you had a bunch of people, both on the Robinson and the Backhauler side, who didn't love the combined entity, particularly the folks on the Coyote or the Backhauler side. They were used to this very small, almost family-run type company because I think Jeff and Paul and John really did think of a lot of people as family.
Yeah.
And so they didn't like the cultural change and working for a big publicly traded entity. So they went off and started their own. Yeah. And you look back at how many of those people have been very successful and built up and sold to other 3PLs or brokerages. So it's really a source of pride for myself and I think most other alum that you look at it and go, the number of people that run on to have bigger, more successful careers in the industry is pretty astounding.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk
about intermodal.
Intermodal.
So what was, when you started, what was the market like? How many railroads were there? Maybe you don't know the answer to that exactly, but what was it like when you started?
Yeah, there were a lot more, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, again, you had no tech tools,
Yeah.
so everything was done by hand. If you needed to rail bill a container, or at the time there were trailers, right? So you had a lot more equipment options. You had a lot more rail options. So that,
just putting a trailer on the black car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a dominant way of doing things because the trailers could hold more weight. You could put 46,000 pounds.
So when did so the 53-foot container was not really a thing as much?
At 53 didn't exist.
Okay.
In the late, it came about really in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
At the time, 48 was the big one.
Okay.
And then 45-foot trailers were still a big thing for you. Had heavy, dense product. We had a lot of paper shippers that wanted to ship 47,000 pounds.
Yeah.
Well, you could do it legally, semi-legally on a 45-foot trailer.
Yeah.
When you started getting into the container versus the trailer, it was better for the railroad economics. Obviously, double stacking makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah. to go to the container versus the flat car.
Yeah, right. Yep.
Like just like for the listeners, the flat trailer and flat car is like literally putting your dry van on the train, like on a flat car.
Exactly.
Like literally parking it on the car.
Yep, that's exactly what it was.
And you couldn't stack those, obviously.
Yeah, and at the time, you had a lot of, particularly in the Northeast, you had a lot of bridge issues.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't double stack.
Yeah.
So the railroads had figured out that the economics were much better on containers, and they wanted to push people toward it. They still are.
Yeah.
You still hear the railroads talk about getting out, and so unless you're one of the big parcel or LTL
Yeah.
you really don't have much of a trailer offering anymore. So everything's been containerized, they modified. So yeah, it was a different change. There were a lot more railroads. There was a lot more competition.
Yeah.
And so it was very, very much relationship driven.
Yeah.
Back then, it felt like the railroads are certainly more sophisticated, and I enjoy great relationships to this day with all the class ones. But but back then, the local people had a lot more control, and so it was less corporate back then. So all the railroads had local salespeople. And now the sales force is significantly smaller than it was back then. It was a more complex business to manage in some ways. And then you look at some of today's rules around when you can engage, how much free time you have. Some of them need gate reservations. So some of the challenges today, I'd argue the business is actually more complex, and we had to do everything manually with more railroads. So there's a lot more thought that has to go into it today. So today's intermodal users or operators rather have to be better, right? There's a lot more chess going on today than there was back then. You didn't have to be as thoughtful and strategic as you do today. It's a much more complex business.
I know, Reed, you wanted to ask.
So I'm blanking. So I have a buddy, Rob List, and his dad worked at C.H. Robinson.
Bob List.
Yeah. See, so and I knew he was involved in intermodal at C.H. Robinson.
Bob was VP of intermodal right before I started.
Okay.
And so I think Bob left shortly after Robinson's IPO.
Okay.
I don't know that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting Bob, or if I did, it was once.
Yeah.
So I really couldn't speak to anything about him. So when I came in, that was already.
So okay, yeah, that's I was just wanted to. I asked him because Rob's a good buddy of mine, and he's a huge intermodal guy. He's a very his company is an agency for Armstrong. They recently acquired their own 53 reefer rail containers.
And they have a contract with what? CPKC?
Yeah, and he's got they went and negotiated. They're like one of the smaller people to go get direct rail contracts. Like what is how is that process interfacing changed over time? Like interfacing with the rails, as a broker specifically?
Yeah.
It's sorry, Phil, before you answer that, just to clarify for our audience, let's just say you're a broker and you want to get a contract with the rail carrier. That's what you're touching.
Yeah, directly with the rail, not using an IMC or what
Yeah. The old school, right? IMC. There's still a handful out there, but most IMCs have evolved into becoming more of a 3PL with some other offerings, because it gets harder and harder to just be one-dimensional. I think more holistically, customers are looking for they want to work with fewer providers who could do more things.
Yeah.
If you're a one-trick pony to a customer, you have limited value. And so that was really one of the things that Robinson did a great job at doing, is building out all these different service lines so that you could go into a customer and say, I want to be your one-stop shop.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter whether you want to move LTL, truckload, air, ocean, you name it, we got a solution for you. We used to say that we can go from Moscow to Chicago, no problem, whatever you need. So
CH would say that.
CH would say that.
Oh, okay.
And so, but going back to your question around, getting a contract with the railroad wasn't that difficult at the time. It was pretty onerous, and it still is, right? I mean, they're a regulated entity. There's a lot of liability that goes with operating a train. So if you were willing to sign the agreement, and we would joke about it and say, the attorneys would never let you sign that agreement, but you didn't have a choice. It was, these are our rules. You're not going to build a new railroad. And so you kind of have to acquiesce to some of the way that they do things. So so we did that. And again, at the time, Robinson was pretty small. When I joined in the 90s, it was probably sub $100 million on gross revenue. And that really came from a couple of, and that's just an intermodal, I mean.
Okay.
And that really came from a couple of acquisitions that they had made, which were more regional in nature. There was a company in Atlanta that they had purchased and a company in Boston area that they had acquired, but organically there hadn't been a lot of growth. And so that was really what we were trying to do, was step it up. So we got, when I got there, they already had rail contracts with everybody. It was just, and then when you go back to 2000, we said we're going to get a little bit more serious about the business. It was, this is at a time when the railroads used to offer rebates on your spend. So we figured out that there was something to be had, and what some of our smaller competitors were doing was leveraging that rebate into customer pricing. And so they'd know that they could get 2, 3, sometimes 4% back from the railroad at the end of the year if you had certain volume thresholds. So they would be able to offer the customer cheaper rates, knowing they're going to get this back end kicker. And so then we started to get smart and say, all right, we've got to get more strategic about how we play the game to be on a more level playing field. So we did all that. And I know, Reed, you want to get to the asset part of the equation. So we did that really from, so then in 2005 we centralized, and then we had some really good organic growth, brought the team together, went and built out a really strong team in the suburbs of Chicago. And then I was kind of looking ahead and seeing J.B. Hunt had this massive asset growth. Schneider had recently gotten into the asset game. So, I wonder if we can...
getting containers.
Getting containers, yeah. And so we should try and dabble in this a little bit. At the time, Robinson had tried reefer containers, and they had this really ill-fated endeavor. It was a triple stack container. Each one was 2/3 the size of a traditional container, and they were built to haul potatoes, which was a big Robinson commodity at the time.
Sure.
So they would take these horrible containers out to a field, blow potatoes into them, bring them, and the idea was you'd stack them 3 high. This might be a question for your buddy Rob, because I think his dad may have been there when this was going on. But they were, we don't know that they were ever triple stacked other than for the photo op. And we quickly realized that they were incompatible with most other commodities because you didn't have the clearance. You couldn't put a forklift in it.
Yeah, sure.
And so it was a really ill-fated venture. And so in the early 2000s, we started to divest ourselves of that initiative. So then you get into about 2010 or so. I said, I feel like we can dabble in containers. And at the time, Hub Group had just started a wholesale program. And so I was working with the Hub team, and I was effectively subleasing containers from them.
Okay.
They did the rail billing for me. We had some account clearance rules in place. We had a great relationship. Worked out
that it came back full circle too a bit.
And so was working with the Hub team, and really what I was doing behind the scenes was practicing. Saying, okay, if I think I got up to about 200 containers from Hub, and make sure we had the right velocity, we had the right load to empty ratios, and the profitability was there. And so that was really the jumping off point. Said, all right, we successfully proved we can manage a small fleet of containers. So then we went and leased a couple hundred. And then in 2011, I went to our former CEO, John Wehoff, who I actually just ran into at the golf course yesterday. Total coincidence. But I said, John, I'd like to approach you about buying some containers, and I'm going to need about 6 to 10 million. He's like, haven't we been down this path before? Like, yeah, but this is different. He's like, are you fucking kidding me?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Freight Caviar podcast. I just wanted to give another special shout out to Dynamic Logistix. Dynamic Logistix gives you total control of your entire shipping operations, live location and status updates every 15 minutes, and the ability to combine multiple orders into a single load, leading to significant savings. Check them out at dynamiclogistix.com. That's logistics with an X.
And if anybody...
With the potato containers.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's like... What are we doing?
Yeah.
So I said, look, if we're going to be serious about this business, we need to do this. And the former CFO at Robinson at the time was in the room. He looks at me. I put together this, as elaborate a presentation as I could do at that time, and said, he looks at me and goes, Shook, you want to bet your career on this? I said, we've come this far. What the hell? There's no turning back. And the CFO, Chad, looks at me and goes, if this goes bad, your fucking head rolls. I got it. I understand. So John was great, very supportive of it. Said, all right, just you've made a good case. Make sure I don't have to go back to the board and tell them that we stubbed our toe again.
Yeah.
It's no problem. So worked out really well. We bought 500 that year. Flew up to Minnesota the following year. said, John, you want to go to lunch? He goes, uh-huh. I know what this is about. He goes, you're hitting me up for more. I go, I need another 6. He's like, what does that get us? I go, it's about another 500 containers. I want to get it to 1,000 owned.
Yeah.
He's like, all right, first tranche had gone really well. So we did that. Yeah, long story short, we ran that for a couple of years and said, we need more. But I decided I wanted to have a little bit more, I wanted to create some optionality within the fleet. So I went and I leased 500 containers. And so did that on a medium-term lease, and that worked out really well. So as we grew our fleet, I thought it was the wise approach was to have this combination of owned assets, long-term lease, and then started to fold in some short-term lease so that if the market caved like it has this past year, you start to exit those leases as soon as you can, and you reduce your expense. Because the cost of a container isn't that crazy, but the pay to have it stacked somewhere is. And so so that was really a way for us to get it up. And at one point we got up to about 3,000 containers. I don't know exactly where they're at today. I think it's still somewhere 2,000 or slightly north of 2. If you're really interested, you can go pull up their annual report, and I think there's a disclosure in there about asset ownership. But it was an interesting way to go about it. It really drew us closer with the railroads because they saw us investing in the business. It was a great sales tool. And let me go back to
And it did some marketing with that logo everywhere.
Oh yeah. We had a film crew. Again, this is before drones. So in 2010 or 2011, we had a Hollywood film crew in a helicopter.
Whoa.
Over the desert. We had to get federal government clearance to go do this. I mean, it
What's the film a train come by? Yeah.
So we got the BNSF to block, I think it was 100 of our containers together.
Nice.
So it looked like a dedicated train. And we had about probably 40 or 50% of the train. And so it's really cool. And that's the video you still see today of all this balloon snaking through the California or Arizona desert.
So you had a lot of conviction around intermodal, obviously, to go and stake your career on all those assets. Like why? Like what brought you to that point? And you obviously had to go fill them.
Yeah.
Right. And I know through my sales experience that sometimes selling customers on rail when they're used to truckload is not always easy. So like why? Walk us through that.
Arrogance, stupidity. I don't know. No, it was one of those things where it was really a customer-centric solution, because at the time you had already gone through a bunch of. As you get into the 2010s, the bulk of the rail consolidation had happened.
Yeah.
So you really only had 2 railroads serving any geography.
Yeah.
So at the time, if you, and then the bit shortly thereafter, the BNSF no longer offered a rail-controlled option. They were private asset only. So if you didn't want to own containers, you were relegated to the Union Pacific. And Union Pacific is a great company, but if they were already handling that customers free through one of their asset providers like Hub Group, or at the time XPO, or through another 3PL using rail control, you couldn't play ball. They wouldn't give you pricing. It was a pain in the ass. And so so what I wanted to do was have a solution that was customer facing, not railroad facing. So this way, if a customer came to us and said, we're unhappy with the UP or their provider for whatever reason, now I have a solution that I don't have to jump through a million account clearance hoops. And so it was a great way for us to be able to go to a customer and say, we're one of, at the time, very few people who can access both the BNSF and the UP. So it was actually a marketing differentiator for us as well. So that helped us grow the business. And it was, again, I stand by that today. I mean, it was up until my last days at Robinson, I had railroads saying, both the Western guys, BNSF saying, buy more containers, come all in with us. UP saying, sell us your containers or get rid of them and come all in. Guys, this is not about you or me. This is about my customer. And so I want to make sure the customers have maximum optionality. And so that was why we stayed the course.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big win.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
Tom, you've been quiet a little bit there.
I've been listening. I mean, fascinating. It's just an incredible story about the history in the last 20, 30 years of BNSF or not BNSF, but of rail.
Yeah.
And
Reed and I went to the CKKC,
we went with Rob to the CPKC booth or box at the United Center. And
preseason game.
Yeah, I mean, the rail is like a hot topic these days still, right? Like, and there's, I mean, in companies like JB Hunt has invested insane. How many containers they have? Like 12, 13,000, tens of thousands, right?
They're north of 100,000.
And they have 100,000. Okay. And like, is C.H. Robinson like in the top 10 list or like?
Yeah, I would say Robinson's a top 10
Top 10.
intermodal provider, but you've got the big three, maybe four. You got Hunt, Head and Shoulders. Hub would be a distant second. Schneider a distant third, and probably STG.
STG. We did an interview with Jeff Enderman of STG. Tom and I did of Christian. Back, when was it in September? That was a great interview.
That was really
He acquired the XPO division.
Yep. So I met Jeff a number of times. I know Paul Svinlin really well.
Oh, awesome.
And so actually, Svinny was just texting me. It was he wants to know what's going on next in my life. And
what is next in your life?
I can't share that for a couple of weeks. There's my new organization wants to do a press release.
Okay.
So, but Svinny was he said, you got to call me next week because he's down at the Masters this week. And so, but yeah, it was. So those four, their commitment, the asset, all the strategies that I put in place in 2010 and that I believed in, I think there's a lot of merit to them. But as the market changes, those four, if you run out the math on it, they probably enjoy a 70 to 75% market share out there. And so it's really hard for a new entrant to make a material impact on intermodal. Right now, the barrier to entry is fairly high. There is a bias toward asset ownership. The railroads, I'm not going to say they're defleeting, but they're not investing in the rail asset at the clip they once were. So you got Hunt with a stated goal of 150,000 containers in the next handful of years. It just became public that they bought out Walmart's fleet after Walmart tried to run. Running a boutique fleet is challenging. And so traditionally, you've had to go through a 3PL. The BNSF has changed that a little bit. They allowed Walmart to have a contract. Amazon has a contract. So the landscape is changing. But
I mean, do the railroads really just want to work with as few people as possible? Is that like...
Okay, I want to add on that just real quick, Phil, because like XPO sold their intermodal division. Here's what SNG. So XPO used to be at the top four, right?
Yeah, well, it was XPO was the original Pacer.
Pacer stack train.
Pacer stack train, which was born out of APL stack train.
Okay.
So going way back into it. So it was this iterative process of getting through that. And so STG owns what was originally APL.
Okay.
But why would stack train? I'm sorry, because there's a lot of people like, what's a Pacer stack?
That was a company.
Yeah. So Pacer, they were essentially a fourth party. They maintained the contracts with the railroads, and they ran a fleet of thousands of containers, kind of like what COFC Logistix does today. So they did it on a bigger scale. And then they enjoyed some very favorable agreements with UP and CSX. And then as those agreements came to expire, the railroads had decided we don't really need somebody who's effectively competing with us on our own network. So they declined to renew the contract, and so the Pacer stack train business effectively went away, and it became part of Pacer Cards, basically the Pacer company, which which was out there. So they had a 3PL, they had a trucking company, and so they folded it under there, and then that fourth party business effectively went away.
So I wanted to follow up on that and ask, why do you think XPO divested their intermodal division? Since it seems like they were in a good position, right? And I know STG bought them out.
I think at the time, again, this is purely Phil's opinion and speculation. It's when Brad Jacobs was on his huge buying spree, and one of the things XPO never really did was fully integrate the companies they bought. And then Brad went back to Wall Street and said the breakup value of the company is even higher than the sum of the parts. And it turned out he was right. I mean, the guy's an incredible genius and financial savant. But I think at the time they just didn't view it as core to their offerings, that they were really focused more on global and then that truck brokerage space, that maybe they thought there was limited upside or something. But they had a really good team there, had some really good people. And I think that was just as Brad was going through the assets and saying which ones are core to our future and which ones should we be thinking about divesting. It was a somewhat easy decision for him to push that off. And a number of people looked at the business and said, do we want to own this or not? And STG was a little bit of a dark horse in it because they were a little unknown in the space. They were more known for their warehousing, but it made a lot of sense to try to now go from warehousing to being a full service logistics provider.
Yeah, door to door, nothing to brokerage.
And Paul Svinlund, the current CEO at STG, was an executive at Pacer and XPO at Pacer prior to the XPO buying. So he knew the business. Yeah.
Cool. I love it. It's cool. Guys, any questions right now?
So I could go forever. I think the rail stuff is very, very interesting. I mean, it's like,
What got you so into rail? Because
I've never done an intermodal shipment in my entire life. I always wanted to try to sell it, but I had never. Customers were just like, customers I feel like tend to be stuck in their ways, whether it's right or wrong. And more often than not, people like, oh, we need it there in 3 days. We need the truckload transit. But like push comes to shove, a lot of people are like, do you actually need it? And they're like, no, like, can you afford to wait? And now, especially like with truckload rates being as low as they've been, like there hasn't been like that cost savings on intermodal on the traditional rail lanes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just a weird kind of market right now.
Yeah. Well, there's more transparency now in the pricing than there's ever been, right?
Yeah.
JOC publishes a rail savings index, so you can actually get a pretty good barometer on what a truckload rate is versus a rail.
Yeah.
But the other common objection customers would throw at us would be, my product doesn't travel rail. I don't like rail. And so it's just, well, do you ship anything with UPS? Yeah. Then you're moving your product on rail.
Yeah.
Because at the time, UPS was, and I think they still are, the largest user of intermodal service. So if you're getting product to or from California.
Well, they all have, all the, like FedEx and UPS both have their own rail brands, right? Like EMP and
Yeah, they got their own mark is what it would be referred to. They have their own containers.
Yeah.
So everybody, they have their own. They also use rail controlled and will contract out when needed.
Yeah.
So there's certainly been some evolution to the overall product there, but it's rail. Again, rail was kind of a dirty word within transportation. It was unreliable. You didn't have visibility. When something went wrong, it went really wrong.
Yeah.
You were usually not measuring delays in hours. You were measuring it in days.
Yeah.
And so there was a little bit more sensitivity. So today's world where there's more visibility, there's more easy access to real data. We used to jokingly call it railroad math. Be like, oh, well, we're 90% on time within 24 hours. Wait, within what? Within 24 hours? My customer doesn't give a shit about 24 hours. They want on time within 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And so that was always one of the things. So now the data's there. The railroads are much more streamlined in a lot of cases. There's the challenges, right? When something goes wrong, it can go horribly wrong. And if the train derails in middle of nowhere, Montana, you can't just lift it off. I had a customer one time go, well, just send somebody out to the desert and take it off the train. So let me explain to you how this works. And so your recoverability is pretty low.
Yeah.
Whereas if a truck breaks down, you can repower the truck usually within a reasonable amount of time. So, there's pros and cons to it, but to your point, Reed, normally there's some pretty good cost savings. And that was really one of the big advantages at Robinson was back before all of this data was readily available. Robinson's secret sauce was how much data they had internally.
Yeah.
How many shipments they moved, access to all of these data points.
Yeah.
So we knew that we were buying at or below market price on truckload.
Yeah.
So we would use that as our benchmark. So at the time, one of the more creative things we did was we went to the railroads and said, I want to bring you freight you're not getting anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so we'll take freight that we are currently going to move on the highway.
Yeah.
But you got to give me access to what we're going to call dynamic pricing.
Yeah.
And so what we would do is basically they would give us some floors and some target rates, and we got to set our own price.
Uh-huh.
And so, if asked, we had the audit. They had the right to audit and justify it. But
So
we would look at it.
you couldn't take a more margin. Yeah.
Well, we took some more margin, but it was usually a competitive way to do it because we'd look at it and say, if we're buying truckload for $900 in a given lane, then what we would say is we'd go back to the railroad and say, I got to offer the customer a cost saving, so I need to do it all in for $800.
Yeah.
So then we would back into, well, here's what my dray costs are, here's what my equipment costs are. What's left is what I'm able to pay you for the line haul. It's at or above the floor, or it isn't.
Yeah.
And my margin was completely out of scope because all we focused on was the buy price. Well, I buy trucks for this. I need to buy for that less X%.
Yeah.
Wow. It's powerful.
Dude, it's crazy. I mean, the rail is like, yeah, I mean, they're big. Especially the railroads are gigantic businesses.
Wow.
You know, and to your point, you can't just go build new railroads. Like, really, I mean, there's so much that goes into that.
They built America.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at it, yeah, I-80 basically runs from Chicago to California along the UP tracks.
Yeah.
Because when the gold rush was happening, that's how people got to and from.
Yeah.
And one of the coolest things I've ever seen is you get into some of the railroad headquarters, some of the historical documents they have.
Yeah.
And so I was at the BNSF headquarters, and they were showing me it's not, well, they have a little mini museum at the guest entrance, but up on their executive floor, they've got original land grants deeding the land from to the railroad from Abraham Lincoln. Letters from Lewis and Clark to their mother about riding the train. And so if you ever have an opportunity to go on and tour one of the railroad executive cars, it's a really cool experience. And I've had the pleasure of doing some overnight trips on it.
Wow.
We got time for a really quick story?
Yes, we do.
And so, so this was, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2013, 2014. We had just come out of we just added to our fleet at Robinson, and the BNSF had invited me. So why don't you get your CEO, and a couple other folks, and let's do an overnight train trip.
Yeah.
And it's Katie Farmer's going to kill me for this story if she hears this. But so we fly to Seattle. So Robinson had and probably still does, a company plane. So we flew to Seattle. We get on the train, and the plan is we're going to go basically 2 days, one night, and we're going to get to Whitefish, Montana.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have our company plane pick us up, take us back to Minnesota. So we get on the train. Everything's great. There's only, I think, a dozen of us on the train. And before we left, our CEO, John, looks at me and goes, "Hey, trains are notoriously late. If this train's late, I'm going to fucking kill you." He said, "I have a board meeting the following day in Minnesota. Missing it's not an option." I said, "John, I'm going to one-up you. My kids were 3 and 1 or 4 and 2 at the time. I'm taking my kids to Sesame Street in Philadelphia, the amusement park. And I've got to be home, because if I tell I'm not telling my kids they're not going to meet Big Bird. And if I tell my wife she's got to take them alone, I may as well stay in Minnesota, because there's not going to be a home to go back to. So we're in this together, John." He starts laughing. So we do our train, or we get on the train. We're cruising along. Everything's cool. We have dinner. We sit around. We go to bed. Next morning, we're doing a business meeting on this beautiful dome car, looking at some of the most gorgeous scenery in North America. And all of a sudden, I notice a couple of folks from the BNSF. They've stopped being photographers, and a couple of them are going back into another car. And all of a sudden, Katie Farmer comes out, grabs me, and goes, "I got to talk to you." I go, "Yeah?" I said, "We're running late, aren't we?" She goes, "We're running late." I said, "Well, how late?" She goes, "It's pretty late." She's like, there's some issues. It was unseasonably warm, was causing the rails to expand, so they had to reduce the maximum allowable speed. Well, and so they had the main line from Seattle blocked, because a lot of it was still single track up there, and we're on the executive train, which has top level clearance. And so, "Katie, this isn't good. This can't happen." I said, "I'm about to get my ass kicked." She's like, "I know." She's like, "Trust me. I don't want to deliver the message any more than you want to do what you're about to do." So I go, "Hey, John." He looks at me and goes, "Don't fucking say it." I said, "Train's late." "How late?" I go, "Many, many hours." He goes, "That can't happen." He goes, "Where are we?" So we find out we're in the middle of Idaho. I goes, "All right." He picks up the phone, calls the pilot, says, "What's the closest airstrip?" The pilot says, "Sandpoint, Idaho." Well, turns out we're about 30 minutes outside Sandpoint. He tells the pilot, who's in Montana, "Start flying to Sandpoint." I go to Katie, I go, "Train's got to stop in Sandpoint." She's like, "What?" Like, we have to get off in Sandpoint. She's like, "Okay." So it turned out they had a small siding there. So we were able to pull the train off, but they could only sit for like 8 minutes was the amount of clearance they had before it was really going to follow up traffic elsewhere.
Whoa.
And so 4 of us get off the train, the 4 Robinson folks, we get off the train, we got our luggage, and we're standing by this dusty train track, and the only ride they could get for us was a BNSF maintenance pickup truck. And then they had to drive us to this airstrip, which is literally a grass strip. So the guy drops us off, and the four of us are standing there, and I can just feel Wehoff glaring at me. And then all of a sudden, over on the horizon, just over the mountains, you see a plane comes in, plane's on the ground for 30 seconds. We jump on, turn up, wheels up. We got back to Minneapolis that night at like midnight.
And some solid recovery. That's a recovery load.
That's what, if you don't have your own plane, that don't happen. Right? But it was, and when Wehoff was retiring, he didn't have a mega party. He chose to do a series of small gatherings. And so he would tell a story about something he did with each person. So he told that same story at his retirement dinner.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We're running low on time here, Phil. I have a quick question. Maybe they have a quick question as well. I'm kind of curious, since you've been in the industry for 27 years now? It's been so. You've seen like a lot of the changes, and you talked about like the innovation and stuff like that. I'm wondering, like right now, like looking from like a bird's eye view of the industry, where do you see the industry like really headed towards, and like what changes are you like looking forward to? Like,
it's everybody's getting smarter, right? When I was in my early 20s, there weren't all these supply chain programs, right? Today it's one of the hottest, sexiest degrees you can go get out there. The technology continues. I mean, you couldn't fathom what we have today 15 years ago. God only knows. I mean, 15 years from now, I don't plan on doing this, but I can only imagine what might be out there for us. So, but at the end of the day, this is still a relationship-driven business. We've had people try to disintermediate the 3PLs forever, going back into the .com era of the 2000s. It was going to be Enron Freight, and then it was the digital brokers, and Robinson, when those, I'm not going to name names, but a couple of those digital guys were out there, one of whom no longer exists, was like, where they put out this press release. Look at what a digital broker can do for your business. Like, we do that. It wasn't new. It wasn't innovative. We were getting beat at the PR game at it. And so the digital evolution has been happening, but it's at the end of the day, this just keeps coming back to relationship. Somebody still has to sell it. This isn't, I gave Paul the example on the plane. If you go order a car right now to go to the airport via Uber, Uber's not committing to a price. They're not committing to sending you a car. There may or may not be a driver available when and where you need it, and it may or may not be at a price you want to pay. Whereas the freight business is very different. If you want to go to a company that makes millions of dollars of razor blades in a trailer, they want to know who they're doing business with. And so that's where the salesmanship comes in. So I think the tech evolution is going to keep pushing tasks to be automated and free up time for those skilled relationship managers to manage more complex customer and carrier relationships. It's probably a long way to get there, but
no, that's brilliant. I mean, very valuable. I love, we covered the past, we covered the present, and where we're going into the future.
Yeah, you guys were sitting by.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, no, it was great.
We live in the Matrix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is meant to be. Phil, anything else you'd like to add before we begin?
No, I appreciate the time. I love what you guys are doing. That was why I started following. I love the way you guys balance the combination of legitimate news, but also bringing a little bit of humor and being a little light at your own expense in some cases. So I think that's really what everybody needs is let's chill a little. Just chill a little bit, right? Don't take yourself so seriously.
When you announce your new venture, when that's public, we should get you on Break on Friday.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. Like I said, I enjoy this industry. It's in my blood. I'm excited to do it. I love coming to conferences like this and networking with people. I mean, the people is what makes this the greatest industry to work in.
You're right. That's actually what brought me into the industry for sure. Being able to just speak with drivers and people and
No, this is awesome. Good stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to the Daily Freight Caviar podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, or if you didn't, leave a review. Let me know what you think. I appreciate any feedback. If you'd like to have more Freight Caviar content, go to freightcaviar.com and subscribe to my email newsletter.